Have you ever had someone look you straight in the face and tell you, you should be grateful just because you were given a seat in the corner? I have. And it feels like a dull blade dragging slow across your pride. My name is Elijah Brooks, a black man, a CEO. But on that fateful night, I wasn't seen for my intelligence, my achievements, or my leadership. They only saw my skin and decided I should be grateful just to be at their table. From the corner seat, I heard the soft laughter, the sweet words dripping with sarcasm, sugar on the outside, but poison underneath. I felt the weight of the entire room, the contempt too casual to even be hidden. They thought I would bow my head, thought I would be thankful for a seat, any seat, even at the edge of the table. But deep inside me, there was another silence. The silence of someone who doesn't need to explain himself, because the truth is already in his hands. This isn't just a story about a dinner or a chair or a table. It's a story about how black people get pushed to the margins and then return, not to ask for a seat, but to rewrite the rules altogether. And if you stay until the end, you'll see the table they beat their chests over turns out to belong to me. So hit subscribe, ring the bell, share this story, and leave a comment wherever you're listening. Because the story I'm about to tell isn't just mine, it's a mirror reflecting every time black people have been told to be grateful for what was already rightfully theirs. And now let's go back to that room. The one lit by crystal chandeliers filled with the clinking of glasses. And the one where I, Elijah Brooks, was pointed to a chair at the far end, in the corner. I stepped into the room blazing with crystal light, the kind that's so bright it can expose every wrinkle of pride on a person's face. The room was massive. White tablecloths stretched across long tables, crystal glasses glittering like they were waiting to be raised by people who had mastered the art of congratulating themselves. Expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of red wine in the air, turning the whole place into a stage where only a few were ever allowed to speak. I stood at the doorway. A few eyes flicked my way. No warmth, no welcome. Just a couple of polite nods, a few raised eyebrows like they were silently wondering why I was even here. A server approached, wordless, just a slight bow of the head before gesturing toward the table. I followed quietly, each step echoing faintly against the marble floor, steady and deliberate. With every step, I could feel the silence tightening. Not the neutral kind, but the judgmental kind. The server stopped at the very end of the table, the only empty seat left. Tucked in the corner, far from the center where handshakes, laughter, and whispers of power were happening. I looked at the chair and understood immediately. This wasn't just a seat. It was a message. A reminder that I was allowed to be here but never to belong here. I sat. The chair squeaked softly, a long, thin sound that cut through the noise like chalk scraping a board. My hand rested on the polished wood table, cold and smooth under my palm. All around me, glasses clinked, conversations rose and fell, bursts of laughter broke out. But no one turned my way. No one poured me wine. No one offered even a scrap of small talk. I was a prop, a piece of scenery, there to make their table look diverse without ever threatening their monopoly on the spotlight. From across the room, a few eyes found me, not curious, not friendly. Measuring. Judging. And in the curve of their half smiles was a sentence they didn't bother to say out loud. At least you got a seat. Unspoken words, but I could feel them like a dull blade pressing slow into my pride. I inhaled deeply. The chandelier still burned bright. The laughter still rose. The table still gleamed with self-importance. But beneath it all, I saw nothing but a cheap performance. People pretending they were unshakable. While I, exiled to the corner, held a truth that would eventually make them all stand. So I stayed still. Silent. Like a man watching a chessboard, waiting for his moment to move. Gregory Vale sat at the center of the table, the seat everyone knew was power's throne. He leaned forward, eyes glinting, not with kindness, but with the pleasure of someone who's found tonight's entertainment. His voice came slow, deliberate, dripping like heavy wine. At least you got a seat. Laughter erupted. Dry. Brittle. Like glass striking glass, sharp, hollow, empty. They didn't laugh because it was funny. They laughed because it told the room they were all on the same side. I stayed seated, the chair creaking again beneath me, longer this time, like metal protesting under strain. In my mind, the sound stretched into the scraping of wood against stone, a long grating note that only I seemed to hear. Because in this room, humiliation didn't need knives. One sentence, one round of laughter was enough to make you the evening's amusement. Gregory laughed with them, but his eyes never left me. That look said, "You're a guest here, don't forget it." Those closest to him nodded along, swirling wine in their glasses, wearing the faces of people who thought they'd just witnessed a small, satisfying victory. A man nailed to his chair by a single remark. I stayed silent. No defense. No forced smile. Because I knew silence is sometimes the sharpest answer. Still, I felt the sting. The familiar sting of being pushed to the margins, handed a seat only so they could remind you it wasn't really yours. Around me, wine poured. Silverware clinked. Suit fabric rasped against leather chairs. Together, they made the cold soundtrack of this performance. They didn't know the man in the corner wasn't here to watch the play. I was here to rewrite the script. Gregory leaned back, smirking, certain he'd put me in my place. But he didn't realize something. He'd just given me my reason to flip the entire table. My hand rested on the cold wood. I could feel every vibration from the laughter rippling through it. And I wondered, how many times has a chair been used to measure a black man's worth? How many times has a single sentence been the rope, tightening slow around dignity's neck? And how many times have we stood from those corners, not to ask for a seat, but to buy the entire table they leaned on? The wood under my hand was ice. Not just from the marble floors and the air conditioning, but from how carefully the room was staged to remind me of my place. I sat, listening to the conversation spilling across the table. Big words spoken in small voices full of smugness. Laughter slicing like balbait. No one turned toward me. I was present, but like a backup chair, there if needed, invisible if not. I thought of history. How often we've been told to be grateful. Grateful for the back row in the classroom. Grateful for the scraps of opportunity. Grateful for being allowed in the room, even if no one planned to hear us. Gratitude wielded like a velvet chain. Tonight, they thought they were singing that same tired chorus, measured in seats, in corners, in reminders of who truly belonged. I looked around the table. Faces flushed with wine. Diamonds glinting as hands gestured a mid-story. Rings flashing under chandeliers. They sat like the world revolved around their chairs. But I knew better. Worth isn't measured by where you sit. It's measured by whether you can make the whole room go silent when it's your turn. I didn't need to pound the table. Didn't need to clear my throat. I let my silence speak. Thick. Uncomfortable. Creeping into cracks they didn't know existed. A few eyes flicked my way, then quickly looked off, as if afraid to meet what was sitting here, quiet but unyielding. Even Gregory Vale, still smirking, blinked once. Maybe he was used to pushback, protests, excuses, fake laughs. But silence. Silence was a language he didn't speak. I took a slow sip of water, the glass tapping the table softly when I set it down. A small sound, but in my mind it was a clock striking midnight. The game had begun. My hand spread flat across the cold wood again. No trembling, no rush. And I wondered, how many times have we been given a seat, not to join in, but to bear witness? How many times have we sat at the edge, listening to laughter that cracked across our backs like whips? No one answered, of course. But I knew this much. Tonight's story wouldn't end with a forgotten chair in the corner. It would end somewhere else, where the table itself, once their fortress, became the evidence of its own collapse. Because while they thought I was just the audience, I was holding the script the whole time. Charlotte Gray stood at the head of the table, a sleek little microphone in her hand like it was a scepter. Her voice flowed smooth as honey, gliding over each word, drawing applause and nods of approval from the room. It was the voice of someone who had mastered the art of controlling the atmosphere, who knew how to sprinkle sugar over every sentence to hide the bitterness underneath. She began the introductions. Each name came with a flourish, applause, praises, carefully delivered compliments. The man who opened new investment frontiers in Asia? Thunderous applause. The founder of a multi-billion-dollar fund, a symbol of resilience and vision. Glasses clinked, prideful laughter filled the air. Every name she spoke was another chapter in the thick book of power, and everyone in the room knew their role in this performance. Cheer, applaud, echo the script. I sat at the far end of the table, listening as her words fell like polished stones. No slips. No errors. Charlotte was too skilled for that. She knew exactly when to pause for applause, when to lift someone higher with a perfectly timed phrase. I watched closely and saw it clearly. Her introductions weren't just praise, they were assignments. They put each person in their place like chess pieces being positioned before the match. Naturally, those seated near Gregory Vale were given extra fanfare. Charlotte's voice lingered on their names, her eyes shining with reverence. Gregory sat tall, nodding like a king, being honored in his own court. Applause roared louder around him as though loyalty itself could be proven through volume. I watched it all, a strange mix of bitterness and amusement rising in my chest. Bitter because I'd seen this play too many times, how words are used to rank people, to decide who deserves to be heard and who's just here to fill a seat. Amused because I knew my turn would come. And I wasn't waiting for applause. I was waiting to see the trap they thought they were setting. Charlotte continued. Her tone stayed smooth, but each name she spoke came dusted in gold. The distance between them and me seemed to stretch wider with every sentence, like an invisible trench opening across the table. She knew that. She relished it, dragging out the suspense, polishing every name before finally arriving at the last one. Because in rooms like this, my part was always saved for the end. Not for a triumphant finale, but for the diversity moment. The one that checked a box so everyone could nod approvingly. And I, Elijah Brooks, had learned long ago to expect it. I sat straighter, waiting. Under the crystal light, I didn't need a mirror to know what was coming. That smile of Charlotte's would bend just so, sweet enough to pass for polite, sharp enough to carry the sting. I drew a slow breath. Because I knew the moment my name left her mouth, it wouldn't be mine anymore. Finally, she reached me. Charlotte Gray lowered her voice, stretched out the pause like a conductor before the final note. She scanned the table, smiling faintly, her eyes lingering on each face before landing on mine. There it was, the deliberate hesitation. The glint in her eyes of someone choosing the perfect spot to stick the knife. And finally, her voice dripped with sweetness, thick with theatrics. The room hushed. A chair scraped softly somewhere, like the whole table was leaning in for the punchline. Charlotte tilted her head, lips curling, and let it drop. Elliot Brown. The laughter hit like a match tossed on dry grass. Not one or two chuckles. The whole table. It rolled through the room, bright and sharp, growing louder as glasses clinked together in mock toasts. This wasn't about a name mistake. This was a performance. A way to turn my presence into a public joke. Get the name wrong? Wrong man, wrong identity, as if I wasn't worth remembering in the first place. As if my being here was so insignificant that accuracy was optional. I sat perfectly still. Back straight. Hands resting lightly on the table. I heard it all. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the little smirks trading places across the room. A few heads leaned together, shaking with amusement like this was the night's highlight. Charlotte laughed too, a dainty little smile hiding behind her hand and pretending regret. Oh, did I say that wrong? Her voice poured sugar over poison. She knew she hadn't slipped. We all knew. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Because getting someone's name wrong is the easiest way to erase them. No shouting. No insults. Just strip away the name and with it, their dignity, wrap it all in laughter so no one could call it cruelty. I looked straight at Charlotte. Her smile faltered for half a second before she turned away. Because I didn't take the bait. They wanted me to flinch. To correct her. to make a scene. I gave them nothing. In my head, the thought was clear. If they can't remember my name tonight, one day, they'll remember my silence. The laughter started fading, but its echo clung to the walls. People turned back to their drinks, their conversations, their little performances of importance. But I knew this moment had left a crack in the room. And cracks, given time, break walls apart. I lifted my glass slowly, took a sip, and set it down with a small, deliberate click. I didn't correct her. I let Elliot Brown hover in the air so they could all hear the ridiculousness of it ringing back in their own ears. And as the laughter thinned, I realized something. The longer I stayed silent, the heavier the air became. Some kept laughing too long, trying to squeeze one more drop of humor from the moment, but my stillness unsettled them. Soon the laughs turned to awkward coughs, clinking glasses, menus being adjusted, napkins being folded. Because when a joke doesn't land the way it's supposed to, it stops being funny. It becomes a mirror, showing everyone exactly what they look like. Charlotte went on with the introductions, but I heard the tiny stumble in her voice before she recovered her rhythm. My silence had thrown her off. Because silence, when sharpened and aimed right, cuts deeper than words ever could. I sat there, watching the room like it was a stage. Some faces still grinned. Others hid behind wine glasses, a few stared hard at their plates. They thought they'd turn me into the punchline. But what I saw was their own insecurity showing through the cracks. Real power doesn't need to humiliate anyone to prove itself. Only the fearful do. And the smile I kept on my face, thin, unbothered, unreadable, started to weigh on them. I could feel it. They wanted me to speak, to defend, to react. But I didn't. And in that unanswered space, the joke slowly collapsed in on itself. I set my glass down again, another sharp click against the wood. The sound carried further than it should have. It ended their little performance better than any words could have. I stayed still, silent, while the room sat in that awkward half-light between pride and embarrassment. Because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't the finale. It was the opening act. I lean slightly forward, lay my hand on the cool wood, and speak. Not loud, not rushed, just clear enough to carry across the room. I lay out the idea, a parallel investment model where funds don't merely compete, but interlink, sharing returns across multiple tiers. A system refined enough to incentivize collaboration, but structured enough that no one gets left behind. In that instant, the chatter dies. Glasses freeze midair. Knives and forks go quiet. The whole table drops into silence, as if someone lowered a heavy curtain over the sound. I see eyes. Eyes that usually gleam with condescension, turn thoughtful. Gregory Vale drums a finger on the table. Evelyn Hart blinks rapidly, clearly doing the math. A few others lean back, their looks a blend of doubt and curiosity. I know I've set something down they can't ignore. The idea isn't theory, it's a direct challenge to how they operate. Every man for himself, profits hoarded. It rattles them because it touches what they fear most, change. I let the silence hang a beat. I want them to hear the idea ringing in their heads without the cover of noise. I want them to see that the man in the corner seat isn't here to watch. He can redirect the whole conversation. Glances flicker and trade cautiously. I recognize the tell. Silence edged with surprise. Not agreement, not applause, just the awkwardness of confronting a truth they didn't expect to hear from me. I stop, sit upright. No extra explanations. The weight doesn't come from my arguing for it, it comes from letting it stand on its own. For a second, I can almost feel the room tilt, the smallest shift, but real. I look around and catch Marcus Reed's eye. He, the other black man in the room, nods, lips pressed like he's working it through. For a moment, I think, at least someone here understands the value of what I just put forward. Someone who, even if he keeps quiet for safety, can't hide that flicker of recognition. The silence holds. I sit, calm, and let them wrestle with what I've thrown into the center of the table. It won't wash away. It'll linger like ink bleeding into a white cloth. And in that quiet, I feel the first movement. Not a surface shift of status, but something internal. They can't reduce me to the guy in the corner anymore. But I also know this quiet won't last. Rooms like this never let an idea from my mouth sit undisturbed for long. While the silence still hangs, Marcus Reed leans forward. His voice cuts clean and fast through the space I just carved out. Actually, here's what I've been thinking. I turn to him. And then, word for word, he says exactly what I just said. Line for line, beat for beat, down to the cadence. No additions, no refinements, just a replay. What stings isn't the theft. What holds me motionless is the room's reaction. Those pensive eyes light up. Stern faces start nodding. Gregory Vale smiles, pleased. Evelyn Hart taps her glass like she's cheering. The room hums again, with an enthusiasm that was nowhere to be found when I spoke. Applause patters down like a sudden rain. Brilliant, Marcus! Now that is innovative. This could change the game. Heads bob, looks of approval pass around. In a blink, I disappear. My idea disappears. All that remains is Marcus Reed, hoisted up as the genius who just discovered unexplored ground. Marcus won't meet my eyes. He knows what he's doing, but he keeps going, punching in a little fake excitement. I see his hands tremble, not with thrill, but with fear. The fear of a man who chose the crowd over a comrade and knows the cost. I sit quietly. No interruption, no grab to take it back. I don't need to. I've seen this play too many times to be surprised. Black presence is allowed so long as it plays the assigned roles, the proof of diversity prop, or the donor of ideas for someone else's applause. Marcus chose the latter. He becomes their living alibi. If he can be praised, then clearly the problem is me, not race. I watch without anger, only a dry, bitter irony. The people clapping think they're praising something new, unaware they're cheering a carbon copy. And Marcus, certain he's won something, doesn't see he's a piece chosen to erase me. I jot a line in my notebook slowly. Not to save the idea. It's mine. I'm marking the moment, when the room decided to crown the copier and erase the creator. I set the pen down and allow myself a small smile. Not bitter. More like the smile of someone who can already see the endgame. Because I know what they're applauding isn't just a stolen pitch. It's a seed that will sprout into their own undoing. I sit still, let the praise thunder as if it belongs to Marcus. But deep down I know it's echoing for a play I still hold the script to. I don't protest. I don't cut in. Don't raise a hand to reclaim credit. I simply open the notebook and write a few spare lines. The pen glides, steady. I can feel a few glances flickering over. What's he writing? I don't look up. Let them wonder. My mouth edges into a thin smile. Not defeat, not spite. The smile of someone watching the wrong move get played and feeling certain the ending is now locked. I let Marcus keep performing his brilliance while the room nods along. Every nod, to me, looks like a signature. And in my mind, they've all just signed off on a cheap duplicate. Gregory Vale leans toward Charlotte with a confirming nod, as if to say, this is the one worth hearing. Evelyn Hart's lips curl, eyes glittering like she's found a rare gem. I watch them, then look back down at the page. No defense, because my silence makes them more uneasy than any argument would. Marcus keeps talking, but I hear the quiver creeping into his voice. Maybe he feels the wrongness in my stillness. He wants me to object. If I speak up, he can smirk, paint me as bitter, turn me into the problem. I don't give him that. I just sit and smile like I'm the one running the scene. In that quiet, a few faces begin to falter. They realize I'm not caught in their little spectacle. That unsettles them. When someone won't play the part you wrote, it means he's preparing a bigger turn. I close the notebook. The soft click on the tabletop is small, but a few heads lift. I keep the same smile, a quiet blade that scrapes slowly, shaving away their illusion of safety. A question rises in my head. One I know will come back to haunt them. How many times have they applauded the copy, only to realize the original was sitting right in front of them, silent and unmoved? I sit as if untouched. But inside, I know this moment. My refusal to react plants a slow fear in them. Because every imitation is eventually exposed. And when it is, tonight's silence will become the sharpest accusation of all. I drew in a long, steady breath, as if I could clear the heavy air in the room. My hand rested firm on the table's cool surface, ready to lift my voice out of the shadows. I'd been silent long enough. I had let them laugh, let them applaud words that weren't even born from the one who spoke them. Now it was time to speak. My eyes moved slowly around the table. Faces glowing under the crystal lights, eyes bright, chairs turning slightly toward me as though to show they were listening. A false anticipation, but convincing enough to pretend I had earned a moment to speak. I saw tight lips, wine glasses lowered, heads nodding lightly as if to say, "All right, let's hear it. Show us what you've got." For a moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Even Marcus Reed, the man they had just crowned with my own idea, glanced over, half nervous, half hopeful I wouldn't tear away the mask he was hiding behind. I knew if I spoke, everything would shift, and that's exactly why they couldn't look away. I bent my head slightly, words gathering in my chest. Just 1 second, but in that second I could hear my heartbeat. Not from fear, but from the certainty that each word would land like a blade across this table they thought they owned. I opened my mouth, the first sound rising, and Gregory Vale leaned forward. His fingers tapped twice on the table. Thud, thud. A small sound, but it cracked through the room like a whip. His eyes glinted. Not warm light, but the cold gleam of a man used to cutting people off, used to owning the floor. Let's hear from someone with more experience. The last 4 words dropped sharp as a hammer. Not an invitation, a dismissal. Laughter bubbled up, not loud, but spreading in waves, rolling softly around the table like a tide of mockery. Some nodded, some smirked, some lifted their glasses as though to toast the insult. I froze, not in shock, I'd expected a moment like this, but the nakedness of it still stung. They had dangled the illusion of a chance only to yank it away in public. And the whole table, like a well-trained chorus, fell right in step. I closed my mouth. The words I had been ready to speak sank back down, unsaid. Yet as I sat there, I felt something shift. Not defeat, but a weapon sharper than whatever speech I had planned. Gregory Vale leaned back, then forward again like a hunter sighting his mark. He repeated it, slower this time, each syllable deliberate. Let's hear from someone with more experience. The final word clanged like iron on concrete, dragging the room behind it. Laughter followed on cue, not the warm kind, but the brittle, gleeful kind that smells of smoke and cruelty. Chairs shifted, glasses clinked, the whole thing conducted by Gregory like an orchestra of scorn. I sat up straight, lips closed. The sentence I had been about to give, one that might have changed the room, was torn away mid-breath. I wasn't surprised, but the sting still cut deep. Not the silence itself, but the method of it, the way they shut the door before I even reached the threshold. Gregory's fingers drummed again, slow and heavy, underlining the point. His eyes slid over me, calm, almost bored. And that was worse than hatred. Hatred at least means you're dangerous. Boredom says you're beneath notice, disposable. Faces around the table chuckled along. Evelyn Hart raised her glass in smug approval. Others ducked their heads, busying themselves with napkins and menus, grins twitching at the corners of their mouths. No one needed to speak. The collusion was silent but unanimous. I watched them and saw the familiar pattern play out. They didn't have to say, "I didn't belong." Gregory said it for them. One sentence, one ripple of laughter, one dismissal dressed up as wit. Here, experience didn't mean knowledge or achievement. It meant permission. It meant not you. I nodded faintly, almost imperceptibly, like a man recognizing an old song on the radio. They wanted to make me voiceless, but in doing so, they revealed everything. How fragile their so-called power really was. Power that needs to gag others isn't power at all. It's fear in costume. I laced my fingers together on the table, calm, no rush, because I knew this wasn't over. Every interruption, every laugh was another debt they were racking up, a debt that would come due. From the outside, I must have looked beaten, silence-eyed, but I knew better. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to fight for scraps of time. The silence I left behind would expose them better than any speech could. The laughter sputtered out sooner than they expected. It always does. Flames die quick without air. In the half-quiet that followed, people began to notice. I hadn't reacted. No flushed anger, no frantic defense, no begging for my turn back. Just stillness. Just eyes, steady and unblinking, watching them instead of answering. Evelyn Hart's smile faltered when my gaze met hers. Marcus Reed swirled his glass, his hand trembling slightly like he feared his own complicity might be called out next. Gregory Vale leaned back, smirking, but I saw it. That tiny twitch at the corner of his eye. He was waiting for me to lash out because if I did, he could crush me completely right here before everyone. But I didn't give him that. The silence thickened, settling over the table like dust. Knife against plate rang sharp in the stillness. The air vent hummed faintly overhead. I sat motionless, letting them sit with the echo of their own laughter. Hear how hollow it sounded now, how childish. Inside, I smiled. Because silence isn't surrender. Silence, timed right, is a mirror. And now I held that mirror up. Gregory turned toward someone else, trying to restart the chatter, but there was a pause. A hesitation long enough to show the control wasn't absolute anymore. And sometimes, all it takes is one crack for the whole wall to fall. I said nothing. I didn't have to. Their empty laughter told on itself. They thought, let's hear from someone with more experience would humiliate me. But all it really did was prove what they feared most. They were afraid of what I might say. I sat there, hands clasped on the cold wood, eyes straight ahead. And I wondered, how many times have we been cut off? Not because we were wrong, but because the truth we carried was too heavy for them to bear? The question stayed in the air, unanswered. But I knew the room wouldn't forget the silence I left behind. After the laughter finally ebbed, Evelyn Hart leaned forward, the pearls around her neck trembling faintly, catching the glare from the chandelier above. She turned toward me, lips curling into a gracious smile, and let her voice drip out smooth as honey over warm tea. So inspiring to see you here. Her tone stretched out soft, like it was meant to be generous. But I've lived long enough to know sweetness often hides a blade in its belly. And in this room, no word was ever spoken by accident. A few people nodded instantly, as if Evelyn's words spoke for them too. I caught the faint sound of a breathy chuckle, the kind people let slip when the real punchline isn't in the words, but beneath them. Everyone heard what she meant. I wasn't an equal here. I was an exhibit. A sign of openness, a piece of decoration so they could claim diversity without surrendering power. And Evelyn, seasoned as she was, sugarcoated that truth like a pro. I looked straight at her, no blinking, no smile. I let the silence stretch long enough to make her compliment hang there, heavy and awkward. Evelyn held her smile, but I saw the corners twitch just slightly. She knew I heard the undertone she had tried to bury under her sweetness. So inspiring. The words landed like a small knife on skin. Not deep enough to bleed, but leaving a sting. It sounded like praise, but carried distance. You are the exception, the rare guest who slipped through the door. And that is the only reason you're inspiring. Not because of intellect, not because of achievement. Just because you exist in a space they still believed wasn't yours. The room broke into polite applause again. Not for me. For Evelyn. For saying what they all wanted to feel. That my presence was remarkable only because it was unusual. I heard the clapping like knives on a cutting board, steady, empty, precise. I drew a slow breath and said nothing. I let my eyes hold hers, cutting through the varnish, the jewelry, the polished manners to the steel beneath. Evelyn smiled on, but her hand on the wine glass tightened ever so slightly. My silence unsettled her. People who live on control always flinch when their script goes off beat. In that moment, I didn't need to correct her. Didn't need to snap back. I just let the sugar melt into bitterness on its own tongue. Because everyone in the room knew, so inspiring to see you here wasn't about respect. It was about ownership. About claiming my presence as their gesture of generosity, not my right to exist. Sweet on the outside, poisoned at the core. The applause rose just enough to sanctify her words, just enough to write my name on the margins. I listened to it the way you listen to coins clatter into a tin cup. Rhythmic, metallic, hollow. A few eyes turned toward me. not with connection, but inspection. Smiles curved politely, the way people smile at paintings, pleasant to look at, never invited into the conversation. And right there, under the chandeliers and the pearls and the polished laughter, I felt the knife twist, a cut so soft it almost passed for kindness. I tilted my head slightly, gaze locked on Evelyn. No blinking, no flinch, just the steady look of someone flipping the mirror back toward her. She held the smile, but I saw the edges stiffen. She was used to victims bowing their heads, mumbling thanks, playing their assigned role. I didn't. And the whole room felt the gap. The applause faded with nothing to catch it. The compliment hung there with no polite smile to close it off. That's when they started hearing it for what it was, shrill, brittle, echoing back on itself. I stayed silent. Let them taste their own words. The silence wasn't for Evelyn alone, it was for every face at that table. A quiet refusal to carry the label they tried to pin on me, the inspiring exception. Evelyn drew her hand back from the glass, eyes flickering before she masked it again. But I'd seen it, the tiny fracture in the porcelain. I didn't need to say thank you. That would have sealed their version of the story. I didn't need to argue either. That would have given them theater. All I needed was silence. Silence thick enough to turn her praise into a mirror, to make her see herself framed in the very words she thought could put me in my place. She shifted in her seat, smile widening as if that could glue the crack back together. But it was there, a hairline split running right through her performance. I turned my eyes away slowly, deliberately letting the weight of it settle over the table. Conversation started up again, stuttering at first, laughter returning, but thinner now, unsure. Because everyone knew something had slipped. A draft in the walls, a seam coming loose. I sat still, thinking, sweet words are often just sugar on the leash. Be grateful, stay small, smile for the applause. But if you refuse to bow, the sweetness curdles. And sometimes, the knife nicks the hand that holds it. Evelyn had trembled, and it wasn't just her. The whole room had felt the chill, the unease of people realizing the mirror was pointed their way now. And in the quiet, I wondered, how many times have we been praised only to be diminished? How many times turned into the inspiring exception so they can keep their rules intact? And how many times has one steady look been enough to crack the mask they hide behind? The moment we shifted to the dossiers, the room changed. Smiles thinned, glasses were set down, and hands poised to receive. This was the part they actually cared about. Numbers. In rooms like this, cold figures are treated as the only language worth trusting. I opened my case and took out the packet I'd prepared to the letter. Glossy black leather cover, crisp pages, each section flagged with firm metal clips. I handed it to Charlotte Gray, who briskly stood to pass copies around the table. Paper rustled in a steady cadence, like a drum roll for an entrance. I watched their eyes as the folders landed. Some gave polite smiles, some flipped straight to the guts. Others tapped their fingers, eager to see what the man in the corner had to prove. I knew exactly what they were hoping for, a slip, a crack, anything to confirm I didn't belong here. I stayed quiet. Let them read. Let them think. I trusted my numbers, the pages I'd scrubbed to perfection. And more than that, I knew I could turn those numbers into a weapon sharp enough to make this room listen. Pages turned faster now, a little frantic. I caught a few raised brows, a couple quick glances traded down the line. Gregory Vale leaned back, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth like he'd caught a whiff of coming sport. Evelyn Hart blinked, her lips curling into a hard-to-read smile. Then the shift came, small but razor-edged. A soft laugh, a throat clearing. The table began to murmur. Eyes that had been curious tipped toward mocking. I felt it before I saw it. Something was wrong. Not with them, with the pages themselves. Charlotte stood at the head, tapping a tidy rhythm on a dossier like a narrator, waiting for the audience to notice the planted clue. She didn't speak. She only smiled, that murky smile of someone who already knows the punchline. I stayed still, but a cold weight settled in my chest. The rustle of paper went offbeat, turning ragged and uneven, like the low hiss that runs through a theater when the crowd senses the plot has a hole. I let my gaze move slowly around the table. I didn't rush to explain. I didn't even ask. In rooms like this, when the murmuring starts, it means someone has moved a piece in the dark. And if someone has tampered with the board, my silence is the most unsettling countermove I have. Fingers interlaced, I took a long breath. The room felt like it was tilting, the air drawing in before a hard break. And I knew this sound, this wrong kind of rustling, was the warning that a knife had just been pulled from behind my back. Gregory Vale broke the murmur first. He let out a short, gravelly laugh that thudded around the table like a judge's gavel. Lifting the packet and wagging a few pages, he said, voice thick with mockery, "Numbers don't even add up." He hit the last 4 words like he'd struck gold. Laughter flared from several corners, spreading quick as fire through dry grass. A palm slapped the table. Someone snorted behind a napkin. A serious face tried to hold, but the mouth twitched anyway. This wasn't information sharing, it was a collective verdict. The guy in the corner had outed himself as an amateur. I looked at Gregory, eyes bright with triumph. He didn't need proof. One line was enough to pull the room into chorus and turn me into the night's entertainment. Evelyn tilted her head, smiling as her fingers toyed with the pearls at her throat, enjoying the rare spectacle. At the head, Charlotte's eyes flashed. A small smile bloomed like confirmation that the scene had hit its mark. I turned a nearby dossier open. The numbers were off. Profit lines shoved to absurd levels. Allocation ratios flipped. Details nudged just enough to turn a tight plan into something sloppy. I knew in an instant. Someone had meddled. Not a mistake. A choice. A trap laid neat as a snare, waiting for me to step. The laughter swelled, bolder now. "Rookie mistake," someone tossed out. Another chimed in. "Surprising. I expected better." The comments stacked up, brick on brick, building a wall around me. No one needed verification. Gregory's cue was enough. They were ready to believe I was careless, green, unworthy of the chair. I sat tall, eyes on the page. My fingertip traced the warped row of figures, and the chill of betrayal rose like frost through my skin. Still, I didn't argue, didn't wave a page, didn't scramble to explain. In a colluding room, the truth isn't in the digits. It's in how they've decided to see them. I lifted my head and scanned the table. Faces lit with self-satisfaction, savoring the moment of turning me into a punchline. And in that synchronized collusion, I saw a seam. When too many people cheer for the same gag, the hollowness of it eventually echoes. So I let them laugh, let them think a few tweaked figures had knocked me flat. Because inside their mockery lay the softest spot of all. The fear of a truth they can't bury forever. I smiled, thin as a backward cut, leaving a question hanging in the air. How many times have they used doctored numbers to diminish us? And how many times will those very numbers become the evidence that exposes their farce? I set my hand on the folder and closed it. Slow, unhurried. Leather met leather, sealing all the bent figures inside. Then came a sound, small but clean. A click. It landed like a dry tap in a room thick with laughter. Not loud, not sharp, but with enough weight that everything else hesitated for a beat. Like a deadbolt slid into place, locking a scene so no one could pretend it wasn't happening. I sat upright, palms resting calmly on the cover. I didn't deliver the reaction they'd scripted. They were waiting for frantic explanations, for pages flung open, for me to tumble headfirst into the trap they'd set. Instead, I gave them a single click. It said more than any defense. I know the game. Gregory's brow lifted. The smile lingered, but something pinched in his eyes. The laughter around the table no longer moved in unison. A few light coughs. A chair scraped. The smug certainty thinned into a question. Why isn't he reacting? I let my gaze pass over each face. Not defiant, not angry, just the look of someone watching a clumsy play. That composure made a few expressions drain of color. Because when a person neither denies nor pleads, their silence becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, it isn't me they see, it's themselves, colluding in a cheap fraud. Charlotte, still at the head, lifted the mic toward her chin, then paused. I saw the hesitation in her eyes. She'd joined the staging, but she hadn't expected me to shut the file so quickly, robbing them of time to stretch the ridicule. I stayed still, and I knew that Click hadn't just closed a folder, it had shut down the illusion. They were working so hard to sell that I was a novice, out of my depth. With that illusion locked away, only one thing hung in the air. The truth that someone had touched my packet deliberately to make me a joke. I didn't need to name it. Not yet. People who love a hidden blade always assume it will never catch the light. But the deeper you bury the knife, the worse it cuts when it's finally found. I lifted my water, took a sip, and set it down. Another quiet note. The room heard it because no one was laughing loudly anymore. I let the silence grow heavy, like a curtain about to drop. Inside me, a question rose, unspoken but already threading through the air. How many times have cooked numbers been used to cut us down? And how many times will our silence turn those numbers into the very proof that convicts them? I slowly bent down and opened the leather briefcase beside my chair. The latch clicked softly, but in a room this silent, it sounded like the opening line of a new chapter. Eyes turned my way, not out of respect, but with a curiosity laced with disdain. Let's see what he has left to salvage. My hand lifted the flap and drew out another dossier. Brown leather, tidy, with no sign of anyone else's hands on it. Every edge caught the chandelier light, gleaming like a quiet assertion. This is the original. I set it on the table. Decisive, not loud. No explanation. No excuse. Just that simple act. And it was exactly that simplicity that stirred the room. A few chairs scraped. Gregory Vale raised an eyebrow, a flicker of his borrowed confidence slipping. Evelyn Hart tilted her head, curiosity mixing with doubt. I opened to the first page, paper bright, numbers clean, not a single error. I slid the folder toward Charlotte Gray and met her eyes. She stalled half a beat before taking it. She flipped through a few pages and I saw her lips pressed together, the brief, involuntary sign of confusion she hadn't had time to mask. The room went quiet. The page turns this time weren't the noisy flutter of gleeful onlookers, but cautious, slow, like everyone had realized something was off about the scene they'd just played. Now the figures lined up, coherent, balanced, and presented with a precision no one could contest. All the ridicule from minutes ago fell straight into the void, with nothing left to cling to. I sat still and said nothing. I wanted them to see, to read, to feel it for themselves. My silence was the frame, the original was the painting. A painting that exposed the truth. Someone had touched the earlier packet, warped it on purpose, and the whole table had piled on, eager to believe the fake. Gregory tapped a finger on the wood again, but the beat had lost its swagger. It sounded off, uncertain. Evelyn stared down at her packet, eyes skimming fast, like someone searching for a door in a maze she'd built herself. I folded my arms and looked straight ahead. Not pleading for recognition, just the calm gaze of someone who knows the scale has started to tip. I didn't need to raise my voice, the original was speaking for me. In that moment, I knew the play had reached its end. They'd tried to make me look amateur with a few doctored pages, but now the real numbers had made them the unwilling audience to a reversal. And this act didn't need a single word from me. I didn't rush. I opened the new dossier, thick, glossy pages whispering as they passed. The chandeliers threw light across blue ink signatures, bright red seals, lines of text that couldn't be argued with. I laid them out on the table, not all at once, but page by page. Each sheet, like a chess piece, dropped into its exact square. Title documents, buyout agreements, transfer papers, legal certifications. I lined them neatly in front of them, covering the same stretch of table where, a few minutes earlier, their laughter had rattled on. I lifted my head, kept my voice even, and spoke slowly, each word clear enough that no one could pretend they'd missed it. This table, the one you were just tapping and laughing around, is my property. I purchased the entire event company. In other words, tonight, every one of us is sitting in a space I own. For a beat, the room froze. No more laughter, no more clink of cutlery. Just eyes widened, like the rug had been yanked out from under all of them. Gregory Vale blinked. His tapping hand halted midair. He opened his mouth, then shut it, realizing any syllable would land flat against the documents now standing in plain view. Evelyn Hart clenched her pearls. The smile she wore earlier disappeared, replaced by an obvious, unguarded confusion. At the head, Charlotte Gray scanned page after page before looking up. Her professional smile had thinned, and what showed underneath was a crack of embarrassment. Around the table, one person leaned back, another cleared a throat, another held a glass that never reached their lips. The whole room looked like a production that had been flipped mid-scene, with actors not yet ready to improvise. I didn't add a thing, I let the papers speak. Every signature was a statement. Every seal, a gavel strike. None of them could deny it, and the bitterest part, for them, was that this truth wasn't new. It had already existed, waiting for the moment I chose to lay it down. I leaned back and looked around. Minutes ago, they'd treated me like a lucky amateur with a seat. Now they understood. They were the guests. Guests in the house they thought was theirs. Guests at the table they'd been drumming on with such certainty. The irony was too clean to miss. They'd used this table as a prop to belittle me, but the table, the physical emblem of their supposed power, was mine. And the second that truth appeared, their stage authority fell away, revealing something thin and a little pitiful beneath. I closed the folder, no click this time. The room had already seized up. Silence settled thick as dust freshly thrown, and no one dared breathe it in. The hall held its breath. A silence so heavy you could touch it, like a weighted blanket laid over the entire table. A few minutes earlier, they'd been laughing, clapping, echoing every cutoff and quip. Now they sat still, eyes scattered and evasive, as if each one feared facing the fact laid right in front of them. Those documents can't be disputed, and the table where they'd been tapping and sneering belongs to me. Gregory Vale inched forward as if to speak, lips moving, then closing. In the chandelier light, he looked like a wax figure with a first hairline crack. Evelyn leaned back, still unconsciously squeezing the pearls. Each bead clicked lightly against the next, a tiny sound that, in this quiet, was a metronome of defeat. Charlotte stared down at the packet again, but her focus was gone. She knew she'd taken a side in a cheap little play, and the play had just been stripped bare. I didn't move. No pounding the table, no raised voice. My silence was the wall now, and each of them was forced to see themselves in it. Faces that had lifted high to mock now tipped downward, dodging, looking for cover inside a room they had been so sure they controlled. Here's the sharpest irony. They were the guests in a house I had bought, guests in a room where they once presumed to decide who deserved which seat, and now guests in a game whose rules had been rewritten a long time ago. I watched them, every scattered glance, every useless fidget. One person reached to pour more wine into a glass that was already full. Another flipped a page back and forth, even though there was nothing left to read. All of it the awkward choreography of people trying to hide the fact that their footing had just slipped away. Inside, I felt a strange calm, not loud triumph, certainty. I didn't need to shout for fairness. The papers on the table were fairness. They were a voice louder than any defense I could make. I drew a slow breath and took a sip of water. Setting the glass down made the faintest sound, but in the dense air it rang like a bell. A few heads twitched, as if the sound reminded them the joke was over and there was nothing left to clap for. I looked around the table one last time, resting a beat on Gregory, then Evelyn, then drifting to Charlotte. I said nothing. I let them do the math on where they now stood. And in that silence, a question formed and hung, needing no voice at all. How many times have we been turned into guests in rooms that were never built for us? And how many times will it be their turn to realize they're the guests? I placed both hands on the edge of the table, steady and deliberate, then pushed lightly to stand. The wooden chair slid back with a long, scraping groan that rang across the room, sharp against the airwound tight like a drawn bow. Ordinary sound on any other night, but here it was the bell announcing the final act. Every head turned my way, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. I rose straight, filled my lungs slowly, feeling the weight of the entire room shift onto my shoulders. The same people who had snickered minutes earlier now sat frozen, statues caught in crystal light. Gregory Vale leaned on the table, pretending composure, his fingers tapping a stuttering rhythm that betrayed him. Evelyn Hart fussed with her pearls, the tremor in her hand impossible to hide. Charlotte Gray clutched the dossier tighter, her eyes finding anywhere else to land but me. I let the moment stretch. The chair's groan still echoed in their minds. I didn't need to speak yet. That sound alone had already cracked the room. When a man stands, the air shifts. When it's the man they mocked, the shift becomes permanent. My eyes moved slowly across the table, over velvet chairs, half-drained wine glasses, faces that once glowed with easy power, now staring down into nothing. The scene pulled up old memories of how many times black men had been forced to stand in rooms that wished they'd stay invisible. Stand to defend, to prove, to demand back a voice stolen mid-sentence. But tonight, I wasn't standing to beg for a seat or for approval. I was standing to make sure they understood. This table, this room, this game, it was no longer theirs. That scrape of wood across marble was the dividing line. Before it, they thought they held the script. After it, they realized they were only background actors in a play that had already been written. I stood still. No raised hands, no thunder in my voice. Just presence, the kind that couldn't be edited, twisted, or talked over. And I knew they were waiting for me to speak, waiting like people who suspect the verdict won't be in their favor. But I kept them waiting. Every second pressed heavier against their pride. I tilted my head slightly. A small smile, not victory, just inevitability. When I finally spoke, it wouldn't be defense. It would be reckoning. I didn't give them a speech. I didn't need one. My eyes made a slow circle around the table, pausing on each face just long enough for discomfort to root itself. Gregory blinked too fast. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat jerking under the lights. Charlotte lowered her gaze as though looking away might undo what was coming. And then I let it fall, one line, steady and unhurried, words dropping like stones on still water. How many times are we told to be grateful for a seat? And how many times will we own the table while they scramble for chairs? No one breathed too loudly. No one moved. The question hung there, weighty, inescapable. It wasn't meant to be answered. It was a sentence. Gregory leaned forward, mouth opening, then closing, like every word he knew had turned to dust. Evelyn's pearls slipped through her fingers. One bead hit the table with a dry clack, the sound of a curtain falling. Charlotte blinked too fast, the poise she'd worn all night shrinking in the silence she had helped to create. The question kept echoing. Each repetition carried every time they'd used chairs as weapons, every time they'd mistaken courtesy for gratitude. And now it planted the unease of a future where they would be the ones chasing seats at tables they no longer controlled. I stayed standing, saying nothing more, letting it carve through the room. Faces shifted. Smiles curdled. The silence didn't need my help. It worked alone, cracking the walls of confidence they had built from laughter, forged numbers, and sweetened insults. A bitter kind of poetry rose in me. They thought laughter was power. That false applause was power. That cutting someone off mid-sentence was power. Yet here they sat. One question hollowing them out like termites in old wood. I gave them no more words. None were needed. Silence was the blade twisting in the wound. I turned and walked slowly, each footstep ringing on the marble, sharp and final. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. Behind me, the room sat motionless, each person locked alone with their shame. No tablecloth big enough to cover it. My steps fell like punctuation. 1, 2, 3. Each marking the end of their little pageant. The talkers didn't talk. The smirkers didn't smirk. The room of crystal and gold had become a cage, trapping its former owners in their own defeat. No one called after me. No one protested. Truth, once laid bare, on paper, in silence, in a single question, does not invite debate. Out in the corridor, the chandeliers threw my shadow long across the floor. For the first time all night, it wasn't small, cornered, or background. It stretched the length of the hall, unbroken. When I pushed open the door, its hinges sighed like the whole room exhaling at once. No one stood to follow. No one raised a glass. They just sat there, among the papers, the silence, and the table that was never theirs to begin with. And I knew, Every time they gathered at another table, no matter how far from tonight, they would remember this one. The question would follow them. How many times must we be grateful for a seat? And how many times will it be their turn to run for chairs? At tables they never really owned. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.